This is the first part of a three-part series on the separation of church and state. I spend a lot of time now preaching the gospel and preaching the truth about the separation of church and state, religious liberty, liberty of conscience, all the matters that are so near and dear to all of our hearts today. The intention with this presentation, this series of presentations, is that at the end of it, you are going to feel very confident in saying why you believe in the separation of church and state. Is it biblical? Is it constitutional? Those are the questions that we want to answer. So, I'm going to begin by talking about the Roman Empire just briefly, because this was the day and age that Jesus Christ was born in. Rome controlled the known world, and Rome had a union of church and state. In fact, they had many gods, and their gods were a reflection of the very licentious people that existed in the Roman Empire. Their gods were a reflection of themselves. And so, of course, they were in very good harmony with their gods, because they were just like their gods, and their gods were just like them. And in Rome was embodied the idea that religion and the state should be united. In fact, we are told by historians that the Romans had maxims with respect to the state religion, the authorized state religion. Neander says that the Romans said, whoever introduces new religions, the tendency and character of which are unknown, whereby the minds of men may be disturbed, shall, if belonging to the higher rank, be banished, if to the lower, punished with death. This was the law in the Roman Empire. You had a union of church and state, of religion and state, and it was against the law to have gods that were not part of the official religious panoply of gods in Rome. It was unauthorized. Cicero taught this principle. He said, no man can have his own private gods. No man shall worship any god that is not recognized by the public laws. And another maxim of the Roman legal system was, what the law says is right. And so the people had their gods. The law said, these are the official gods. You are not allowed to have any private gods. And the law said, this is the correct way to live. Into this system comes the Messiah, because he is living in Judea, growing up in Judea. He's the Messiah. And he is introducing new concepts that are going to shake the world. And one of those concepts is the separation of church and state, as we will see. Now, what you need to realize about the Roman Empire is that they were a very religious society. They considered themselves to be exceedingly religious. If a man came outside of his house and went into his chariot, he had a little form that he would recite, a little prayer. If he went to the marketplace, he had a little prayer. Whatever he did, he had some religious observation, but it was all formalism. Into this system comes the first Christians, and the first Christians say, these gods are no gods. These are not real gods. You should turn your back on these gods. And they would get arrested because they were disturbing the peace. They were introducing a new god into the Roman Empire. And the magistrate, the judge, would look at these early Christians and he would say to them, listen, I am here as a representative of the law. Do you want to be punished? I don't want to punish you, but it is against the law for you to introduce new gods. And you are introducing this man, Christ Jesus, who you say is God and that he is the creator. Now, I want you to acknowledge that the gods of Rome are the gods. Take a pinch of incense and put it on the altar, and you won't be arrested again. And the Christian could not do that because Jesus Christ is King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and all the other gods are not gods at all. And the Roman magistrate would try again. He would say, listen, you say Jesus Christ is God. Well, we believe in many gods. Just say Jesus Christ is one of the gods. Take the pinch of incense, put it on the altar. And the Christian could not do this because Jesus Christ is not just one of the gods. He is God, made flesh, God with us. And so they could not do that. And the magistrate would become enraged and say, you're being very unreasonable and I must punish you. And they were executed by the thousands. And this is why they were executed. Because not only did the early Christians say that we have a right to believe that Jesus Christ is God, we have an absolute right to tell all of the Roman citizens that your gods are no gods, that Jesus Christ is the only God. And so they were punished. Now, Rome was that system where the state and religion ought to be united. Whereas America is that system where the church and the state ought to be separate and are separate. And you see the clash between these two systems of thought. And of course, the papacy descends from the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire says that church and state are united. The papacy also says church and state are united because the papacy is both church and state. The Pope is both a king and he is the head of the Roman Catholic Church. In fact, the Pope is the only universally sovereign monarch in Western Europe today. Now, we have a competing narrative that is rising in society. The question is, should church and state be separate? And a collateral question to that is, should the first table of the Ten Commandments be enforced? How many of you, by a show of hands, have heard the question, should the first table of the law be enforced? Anybody here? Okay. What is the answer? Do you know 100% what the answer is? Because it is very important, because this question is coming to each of us. You'll not be able to escape it. It's going global already. Everybody is talking about the separation of church and state. And if they're not talking about it, then they're going to be talking about it tomorrow. And your neighbor is going to be asking you, and we have to know the answers to these questions. One of the biggest proponents of enforcing the first table of the Decalogue is this man here. His name is Pastor Doug Wilson, and he is the church pastor of a church in Moscow, Idaho. And we're going to hear what he has to say in a moment. He has a couple hundred churches around the country, and they believe in the enforcement of the first table of the Decalogue. And we're going to listen to a few short clips here.
So I'm in favor of a formal recognition of the Protestant faith as the faith of the state and the people, but I don't think tax money ought to go to a particular denomination. So yes to separation of church and state, but I do believe that there needs to be a working relationship between the state and the church.
Right, so he says he's in favor of a separation of church and state, but he also says he's in favor of making Protestantism the official religion of the state. Okay, now there's the quote there for you to see. I am in favor of the formal recognition of the Protestant faith as the faith of the state and the people. All right, now the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And when it says an establishment of religion, what it means is an established church. Congress shall not establish a church as the official religion of the nation. Now, is Protestantism a religion? Yes or no? It certainly is a religion. Of course it is a religion. So by saying that he believes that Protestantism should be made the official religion of the state, he is arguing for a union of church and state. He says that's not what he's doing. But of course, that is exactly what he's doing. Now, Abraham Lincoln once said, he says to his cabinet, he says, how many legs does a dog have? And they said 4. And he says, what if I call the tail a leg? And they said, well, then 5. And he said, no, that's the wrong answer. The answer is 4. Because it doesn't matter what you call the tail. You can call it a leg, but it's not a leg. So a dog only has 4 legs. And so it doesn't matter if you claim that you are against a union of church and state. If you want to make Protestantism the official religion of the state, you are, of course, in favor of a union of church and state. Another quote here, this is from an interview with Heritage and Hope Ministries.
Whatever the laws move in that direction, then you start legislating the first table of the Decalogue.
Yeah, I'm in favor of legislating the first table of the law, but I do think there's a great value in a society being on the same clock.
All right, so he's in favor of legislating the first table of the law. This pastor also, same thing, in favor of legislating the first table of the law. These videos are all over YouTube. Now, this is not a unique thing in society today. People have been talking about a union of church and state in Christianity for a long time. What's unique about this is that it's being picked up by mainstream news. CNN is interviewing this man. Pastor Doug Wilson. It's been seen millions of times. Wall Street Journal has done an interview on this. Fox News is covering it. The question is going mainstream. Society is sick. How do we save it? We have to have a union of church and state. Short clip here.
Adopt a distinctly Christian preamble, and then all the 10 commandments must be legislated. What we've done is we thought the second table of the law, so second table meaning commandments 5 through 10, the commandments of God that pertain to our horizontal relationship with our neighbor, like don't steal, don't murder, these kinds of things. We think that should be legislated by the civil magistrate, but the first table.
So the question is should the first table of the law be legislated? No. All right. How do we know that? How do you prove it? We're going to come to that in depth here, but I want to tell you a brief story before we begin that part of the presentation. Let's say you are a parent and you're going away for a week, and you are leaving your eldest daughter in charge of your 3 children. So you have 3 children, and your eldest daughter is in charge. And you are going away, and you gather your children in the living room before you leave, and you say to them this. You say, we're leaving for a week. We're coming back in a week. Big sister is in charge. You're to do what she says. And you go away. Let me ask you this. Is that meant to be a permanent delegation of power, or is it temporary? Okay. Now I want you to think about this in the context of church-state relations. Temporary grant of power. Okay. Where does the state get the authority from? Gets it from God, right? Is it permanent or is it temporary? It's temporary. All right. That's point number 1. Point number 2. You gather your children in the living room. You say, listen to big sister. Okay, good. Now, big sister says, I've made dinner. It's time to eat. Is that within her lawful grant of authority? Right? Big sister says, don't just eat your garlic toast, eat your broccoli. Is that within her limited grant of authority? Big sister says, all right, it's time to wash the dishes. Is that within the limited grant of authority? Big sister says it's time to go to bed. Is that within the limited grant of authority? Big sister says, clean your room. Is that within the limited grant of authority? Big sister says, clean my room. Was it the intention of the parents to allow big sister to compel the younger children to clean her bedroom? What if big sister says, now you ate your broccoli, now eat this cockroach? Okay, this would be an abuse of the authority of big sister, right? So you have a limited delegation of authority to big sister, and it is limited in scope, and it is limited in duration. Now, one of the things that you will hear pastors referencing in support of the idea that the first table of the law should be enforced is Romans chapter 13. But one of the interesting things about Romans chapter 13 is that it makes no mention of the first table of the law. Romans chapter 13 deals with the last 6 commandments. It does not touch on your obligations to God, because those are not the purview of the state. Moses comes down the mountain. He has the 10 commandments. Are they on one table or 2 tables? Why are they on 2 tables? Moses is sending a message from God, or God is sending a message through Moses, rather. Right? That your obligations to God are separate from your obligations to your fellow man. Okay? Continuing that interview here briefly, just a few more clips.
If we go back to early American history in the colonies of Virginia, the third penalty for Sunday violations was the death penalty. And in the Maryland Toleration Act, the third penalty was a public whipping.
The old Baptists would certainly be in favor of a hey, no ordinary commerce on a Sunday.
Right. How much of an incrementalist are you? Does your ideal political leader get into power and then shoot the moon? Sabbath legislation, the whole deal?
So you mentioned 55%. I don't think that you even have to have 55% of support or a majority. I mean, I guess I'm an elitist in that sense, but in the way there's a lot of people who will just kind of shift with the imagination set by the people, the ruling class. So you actually don't need like a majority support of the population. You just need a strong-willed minority. And then that ruling class can shape the imagination of the majority, which I think Trump is doing now, because for decades we've had a very kind of weak right when it comes to imposing your will upon the executive branch. And now he's actually revealing to the country that, oh wait, there is this executive who's vested with the executive power, who can exercise power within his branch.
We've seen those discussions with Stephen Wolfe where it's going that direction. And our concern is that long-term down the road, our people are going to be facing imprisonment in the future as they did back in 1888.
So, and if that were to happen, that would be bad, right? But if that bad thing happened, it would be way better than what you're going through now.
How so?
We just finished slaughtering 60 million babies.
All right, so a few things in that clip. First of all, Stephen Wolfe is saying you actually don't need a majority to impose religious dogma on society. What you need is a ruling class, and then the people will follow. The second thing he's saying is that we have a strong religious right, and we want to impose our will on the executive branch. So that is the church influencing the state. And he's saying that's what we see right now. That's what's taking place. And then, of course, Pastor Wilson says, even if Sabbath keepers suffer, that's preferable in this new paradigm that we're setting up to the slaughter of 60 million babies. So preventing the slaughter of babies justifies removing liberty of conscience from Sabbath keepers. Of course, that's a very Machiavellian argument. The ends justify the means. Now, another argument that they are making is, and I think Jonathan touched on this morning, is that John Calvin is the father of America. And so they skip over the Roger Williams narrative and they say Calvin is the father of the country, or the grandfather of the country. He is the one who starts America. And of course, Calvin believed in a union of church and state. He believed in the enforcement of the first table of the Decalogue. And we'll touch a little bit more on Calvin in the second presentation. But Roger Williams has been called the first American. He's the founder of Rhode Island. And we're not going to go real deep into Roger Williams. What I would like you to see is that one of the things that Roger Williams was in hot water about was that he recognized that the magistrate could not enforce the first table of the law because that was off limits. So Roger Williams, this is from the History of the Baptists, page 628, Williams saw at a glance that corruption and persecution must work out in America the same results as they had wrought in England. At once, therefore, he protested as a sound-minded man that the magistrate might not punish a breach of the first table of the law, comprised in the first 4 of the 10 Commandments. So not only did Roger Williams say the judge cannot enforce a breach of the first table of the law, he tied that explicitly with respect to Sabbath. He was charged, actually, which is one of the reasons why he was fleeing and went to live with the Native Americans. Roger Williams charged. A letter was written to Mr. Endicott by order of the General Court of Massachusetts, in which the court charged Williams with having declared, so here's his offense, his opinion that the magistrate might not punish a breach of the Sabbath. So Roger Williams is fleeing because they want to deport him to England. And he is fleeing because he has said the judge cannot punish somebody for a breach of the Sabbath. Now, at this point in time, of course, he means Sunday, because those two thoughts are interchangeable in Massachusetts at the time with the Puritans. And he says, nor any other religious offense, as it was a breach of the first table. So they were looking for him, and that was one of the reasons why he was arrested. and brought in front of the magistrate. One more clip here from this series.
But when it comes to the first table, we have a problem. For example, the first Sunday laws by Constantine, they were rest days for Sunday, but then the Roman Catholic Church came at the Council of Laodicea and stated, no, Christians may not Judaize, they may not keep the Sabbath day, the seventh day. And then persecution started, and the Valdenses were persecuted, those that kept the Sabbath, and the Albigenses, and down through the line in Ethiopia, the Celtic Church. There was a tremendous persecution on that issue.
If you don't enforce the first table of the law, if you don't have your laws based on the first table, you've got no reason for defending the second table. You have no reason to not allow Muslim government officials, Hindu government officials, atheist government officials. But once you have atheist government officials or Muslim government officials, you don't have the same respect for human life.
So he is proposing a test for office in America, and that also is rewriting the Constitution. Article 6 of the U.S. Constitution says that no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to an office or public trust under the United States. So can an atheist hold public office? Yes. Can a Muslim hold public office? Yes. Or a Hindu? Yes, in America today. So these Christian nationalists, they want to make that unconstitutional, and they would get rid of the Sixth Amendment, or Article 6, of the Constitution. Now, when you take civil office, you have to swear an oath to uphold the Constitution, but there's no religious test for office. And of course, there are groups of people, denominations, who are getting sucked up into this movement to unite church and state. And it's shocking to a lot of people because you have the history of the Baptists. This commenter, this is from 1910. We wonder how many of our readers have read the history of New England's colonial times, or of the persecutions, the whippings of the Baptists and the Quakers, and the banishing of Roger Williams by the Puritans, because they failed to make any separation between church and state. They thought the stability of the state depended on people's observing certain religious forms. And as the Baptists and Quakers would not conform to the religio-political order of government, they were punished, or rather persecuted. It was to prevent a repetition of such persecutions that the First Amendment to the Constitution was added. You know, the Baptists suffered terribly in America in the colonies before July 4, 1776. There was a case of a man, I came across it in a book I was reading, about a Baptist man. He was arrested because he was having a religious ceremony in Massachusetts. And it was illegal to gather as a Baptist in Massachusetts because Puritanism was the religion of the state. And this man was arrested, and he was taken to the whipping post, and he was sentenced to 30 lashes. You could just imagine what that would be like. They bury your back, tie your hands to the post, and they give you 30 lashes, and they turn your back into ground beef. But he was willing to endure it, and he was walking to the whipping post, and his friends who were in his religious gathering came out to him, and they stood in a single file line, and they shook his hand as he went past, one after the other. And each of those people who shook his hand were each given 10 lashes. So this is what the result of a union of church and state is. Now, recently, in fact, within the last couple of days, you heard a very prominent political figure, in fact, it was the vice president, say that the separation of church and state is not properly understood. It's not in the Constitution. And that is further to a narrative here. We're going to have some slides on that in a moment. But as soon as you invoke a union of church and state, you invoke the punishments for religious violations. Do you see how that is the case? All right? You cannot separate the two. If you believe in a union of church and state, you invoke the punishments for breaches of religious laws. Okay? It is inevitable. And that is why the First Amendment says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Now, the American founders did not get this principle out of thin air. Where did they get it from? They invented it. No, it comes out of Protestantism. But Protestantism did not invent it either. Where did it come from? It comes from the Bible. It comes from Jesus Christ, because it was like a nuclear blast going off in that little corner of the world in Judea. The Pharisees and the scribes come to Jesus and they say, is it lawful to pay taxes or not? Should you pay tribute to Caesar? And they're trying to get him into trouble. If he says no, then they can report him to the Romans. If he says yes, then that creates unhappiness amongst the Jews, because they hate the Romans and they're always on the verge of an insurrection. And Jesus says to them, why are you tempting me, you hypocrites? Show me the tribute money. And they brought unto him a penny. And he said to them, whose is this image and superscription? They said unto him, Caesar's. Then said he unto them, render therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. And they marveled. Now, incidentally, now, of course, you've seen the Roman coins. Caesar on one side, there's his face. In America, it has been illegal for well over 100 years, probably more like 200 years, to have a picture of a sitting president on the currency. Did you know that? It's against the law. Because America does not have a king whose face is on the coin, the king's face in these countries with a king. King Charles III, his face is on the new coins, right? Queen Elizabeth II, her face is on the coin. Whose face is on the Vatican coins? It's the Pope's face, because he's the king of Vatican City. But in America, it is against the law to have the sitting president's face on currency. However, that is being overturned. And ostensibly, it's because it's the celebration of the birthday, 250-year anniversary. The president's face is now going to be on the currency. And there's a big uproar about it, because it has never happened in the history of America, because America does not have a king. So that's interesting, because we're moving back towards Rome, and many things point to this. So Jesus is saying some things belong to Caesar, some things belong to God. You cannot give to Caesar what belongs to God. The big sister does not have authority over every single realm, right? The parents are coming back. Who gives you life? Does the state give you life, or does life come from God? God gives you life. Since God gives you life, our religious obligations must be to him. He can only forgive sins. He can only grant eternal life. Therefore, since God gives us life, there must be a separation of church and state. But they want to put them together. Rome said everything belongs to Caesar, including religion. The state is the highest form of good. To honor the state and the pagan gods is the whole duty of man. But Jesus said, you are not to give to Caesar what is God's. Caesar has no right to what is God's. And he says, fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. So in Rome, they said to obey the law is the whole duty of man. But the Bible says, fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. And so you can see why there was an inherent conflict between Romans and Christians, or between the nation of Rome, rather, and Christianity. Because Rome says the highest form of good is to obey the law, is to obey Caesar, is to be a good citizen. This is the highest duty of man. This is the whole duty of man. But the Bible says, fear God and keep his commandments. This is the whole duty of man. Now, A.T. Jones said in The Two Republics on page 144, the state being divine and Caesar reflecting this divinity, whatever was God's was Caesar's. Because in Rome, they believed that the state was divine and Caesar is an embodiment of this divinity. When Jesus says, render to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's, what Jesus is saying is Caesar is not divine. Caesar is not God. You cannot render to Caesar what is God's. And so Jesus, in stating that, is attacking everything that is considered to be divine about Roman society and about Caesar himself. So A.T. Jones notes that when Jesus makes this declaration, he is attacking the divinity of the state. And when they want to put church and state together in America or in the Western world, they are saying that the state has jurisdiction over religious things, that it has some authority to exercise. And that is false according to the Bible. Now, what is the secret of America's greatness? We're told in the book, The Great Controversy, republicanism and Protestantism became the fundamental principles of the nation. That's not talking about the Republican Party. It's talking about the republic, the Republican principle of the United States of America, because America is not a democracy. America is a republic. The will of the people is not the highest law in America. The Constitution is the highest law in America. Okay, there's a big difference between those things. In Rome, they would say the voice of the people is the voice of God. That's correct. That's right. Vox populi, vox Dei. And that means the voice of the people is the voice of God. We are told in the Spirit of Prophecy that the reason for America's greatness is that these two principles are instated. Two horns the lamb-like power has. The secrets of the principles of Protestantism and republicanism and the separation of church and state. Because Protestantism is the separation of church and state. A.T. Jones says, under our Constitution as it is, the total separation of church and state and the perfect religious liberty thereby assured have been a beacon light of progress to all other nations for 100 years. The American principle of the liberties and rights of man had an irresistible influence upon other nations in all parts of the earth. This is the genuine principle of Protestantism. So what is the genuine principle of Protestantism? It is the separation of church and state. For that reason, you want to talk about why America is great. It's this principle. It's this right here. This is what it all boils down to. And so when you have people saying church and state ought to be united in America, and you have Seventh-day Adventists who are saying, here, here, I agree with that. They don't understand the first thing about Protestantism or about America. In fact, the separation of church and state is the most American thing there is. And that actually is true patriotism, is standing in defense of that principle. We'll come to that here. Okay, now, we're going to talk about the history of this nation. Two tables. This is the second president of the United States. His name is John Adams. Most people do not realize that John Adams published a dissertation in the Boston Gazette, 1765. He wrote anonymously for fear. What state is Boston in? Who is the ruling power in Massachusetts? The Puritans. So John Adams is writing in a Puritan city, in a Puritan state, and he is saying the union of church and state is wicked. That's why he wrote anonymously, because he could get in trouble. After he became the second president of the United States, or after America became a nation, it became public. Who had written this? John Adams wrote this. So he says, since the promulgation of Christianity, the two greatest systems of tyranny that have sprung from this original are the canon, or the church, and the feudal law. So he is saying the worst systems of government are church law and feudal law. Now, church law is that law where the religious power tells you and controls your religious thoughts and practices. Feudal law is that system where you have lords and knights. You don't really have a middle class. You have a king, you have knights, you have barons, and you have peasants. And all of us in this room, I dare say, would be peasants. And incidentally, in the Roman Republic, the lower class formed the vast majority of Christians. And the penalty for espousing other gods in Rome was what, if you were of the lower class? Death. And so John Adams is saying, look, these are the two worst systems. And just we're going to look quickly at this quote here. This is John Adams, second president of the United States, part of your heritage. He says, by the former of these, by the church law, he's saying, the Romish clergy enslaved the mind of man for the aggrandizement or the exaltation of their own order. He says, all the epithets I have here given to the Romish policy are just, and will be allowed to be so when it is considered that they even persuaded mankind to believe, faithfully and undoubtingly, that God Almighty had entrusted to them the keys of heaven, whose gates they might open and close at pleasure with the power of dispensation over all the rules and obligations of morality, with authority to license all sorts of sins and crimes, with the power to depose princes and absolve subjects. And he says, he talks about the superstitions of Romanism that were put onto the people. He says all of these opinions were enabled to spread and rivet among the people by reducing their minds to a state of sordid ignorance and staring timidity, and by infusing into them a religious horror of letters and knowledge. So he's saying this is what the church law did. That's why it's bad. He goes on. He says, thus was human nature chained fast for ages in a cruel, shameful, and deplorable servitude to him and his subordinate tyrants. So John Adams is writing about the papal church. And he says human nature was chained fast for ages in order to serve him and his subordinate tyrants. Who is he talking about? He's talking about the Pope. And his subordinate tyrants are the priests. So this is the second president of the United States saying that the papacy enslaved the minds of people and made them slaves. And that it was foretold, now he's invoking scripture, that the Pope would exalt himself above all that was called God and that was worship. So he's equating the Pope with Antichrist. Because he's invoking 2 Thessalonians 2, verses 3 and 4. So you have the second president of the United States saying the Pope is Antichrist. He's quoting it. The papacy has never resiled from statements like this. We hold upon this earth the place of God Almighty, not just a civil power, but a religious power, right? That the Pope is God on earth. The supreme teachings in the church is the Roman pontiff. Union of minds, therefore, requires complete submission and obedience of will to the church and to the Roman pontiff as to God himself. It is absolutely necessary for salvation that every human creature be subject to the Roman pontiff. This has always been Catholic dogma. They've never changed it. The Pope and God are the same, so he has all power in heaven and earth. So you have a union of church and state in the papacy. Now, Revelation chapter 13 says that the lamb-like beast will make an image to the beast, right? Or cause an image to the beast to be made. So what is the image to the beast? You have to look at what the beast is. What is the beast? The beast is a union of church and state. Now, what are the religionists proposing that they do? They're proposing to make a union of church and state, right? So that is making a image to the beast. Because the beast is a union of church and state, the sea beast in Revelation 13. And so the proposal to unite church and state is the making of an image to the beast. This is what Ellen White says. I'm not making it up. Nothing in this presentation is made up by me. Now, some people are saying the UN is the image to the beast. Have you heard this? This is being popularized right now. Okay, that's not true. Now, I'm not the one telling you it's not true. The spirit of prophecy will tell you it's not true. The image to the beast is the union of church and state. The Protestants today who want to control the government, that is a union of church and state. That's an image to the papal power, because the papal power is both church and state. We'll come to the quote in a moment here. All right, so this is a sitting congresswoman. Some of you know her or have heard of her. You've seen this quote before. It's getting kind of famous. I think it's important. Have a listen.
The reason we had so many overreaching regulations in our nation is because the church complied. The church is supposed to direct the government. The government is not supposed to direct the church. That is not how our founding fathers intended it. And I'm tired of this separation of church and state junk that's not in the Constitution. It was in a stinking letter, and it means nothing like what they say it does.
So, you have a sitting representative of the state of Colorado saying the separation of church and state is garbage. It's not in the Constitution. It was in a stinking letter. Now, you need to know as a Christian whether or not there ought to be a separation of church and state in America or not. You must know the answer. And the Baptists once knew the answer, but they're kind of foggy on it now. All right? And so is our church. What is the answer? There's the quote, okay? The whole purpose of this presentation is to give you the answer, is to give you ammunition. It's not from me. There's no credit to me. The reason you need to know this is so that you can tell your neighbor, because this is for the whole bag of marbles. This is the whole shebang. The separation of church and state. That's the secret of American greatness. What do you think happens when America loses the separation of church and state? Here's the quote. The church is supposed to direct the government, true or false. I'm tired of this separation of church and state junk. That's not in the Constitution. It was in a stinking letter, and it means nothing like they say it does. You must know whether this is true or false. Now, who wrote the stinking letter?
That's a good question.
All right. In fact, the stinking letter comes from no less a luminary than Thomas Jefferson, who is the author of the Declaration of Independence, who is also the third president of the United States, who is also the president when he writes the stinking letter. Here is the copy of the stinking letter. Now, Jefferson, I think maybe perhaps had not been inaugurated at this point. I would need to check that. It's 1802. The Danbury Baptists are writing to Jefferson because they want to know whether or not the separation of church and state is going to hold. Because in fact, the Baptists have had to flee out of their original place to another state because of persecution. And so they are writing to Jefferson saying, do we still have separation of church and state in this country? Please tell us the answer. Jefferson is writing back to them. It's in the Library of Congress, the stinking letter. Here we go. Gentlemen, the affectionate sentiments of esteem and approbation which are so good as to express towards me on behalf of the Danbury Baptist Association give me the highest satisfaction. He says, my duties dictate a faithful and zealous pursuit of the interests of my constituents, and in proportion as they are persuaded of my fidelity to those duties, the discharge of them becomes more and more pleasing. So Jefferson is saying, the more you are convinced that I'm doing what I'm supposed to do as president, the more happy I am. Now, the key paragraph. Thomas Jefferson to the Baptists. Believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God. So what does Jefferson believe? He believes that your obligations with respect to religion are only between you and God. The state has nothing to do with that. Jefferson says that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legitimate powers of government reach actions only and not opinions. I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people. Okay, so is it just the act of Congress? No, Jefferson is saying this is what we all agreed when we were nation building. It's the act of the whole American people which declared that their legislature should make no law. Now you'll notice the quotation mark there. Should, quote, make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. What is Jefferson quoting? The First Amendment. He's quoting the First Amendment. He's quoting the Bill of Rights. So Jefferson is telling the Danbury Baptists that the answer to your question about a union of church and state is where? It's in the First Amendment. Article 1, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. So I don't want you to miss it. Jefferson is telling the Danbury Baptists. Now, presumably Jefferson knows something about the Constitution. I don't know. What do you think? Yeah. Jefferson is telling the Danbury Baptists that the Constitution says that there is a wall of separation between church and state. Now, but 2 days ago, you had the vice president say that there's no separation of church and state in the Constitution. Is Jefferson right, or is the vice president right? I want you to listen to these quotes from Thomas Jefferson. He's not here to speak to you because he's dead, but his pen still reaches us. I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man. Jefferson is saying that system of religion, which combined church and state, is tyrannical. That's what John Adams said. Another quote, Jefferson, Almighty God has created the mind free. All attempts to influence it by temporal punishments or burdens are a departure from the plan of the holy author of our religion. No man shall be compelled to frequent or support religious worship or ministry, or shall otherwise suffer on account of his religious opinions or belief. But all men should be free to profess and by argument to maintain their opinions in matters of religion. Hands off. I saw a presentation by a Baptist the other day, and he says, how dare you try to tell me that the Bible is the jurisdiction of the government? He says, take your hands off my Bible. He says, how dare you take my Bible and make it the subject of the deceit and the intrigue and the scheming that takes place in the swamp in Washington, D.C. Jefferson again, the opinions of men are not the object of civil government nor under its jurisdiction. Now, Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. James Madison is the principal author of the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. There it is, First Amendment. So Madison wrote the first draft of this. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, to establish a state religion, to establish religious obligations, hands off, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or the press or the right of the people to peacefully assemble and to seek a petition the government for a redress of grievances. It's important to recognize, I think, parenthetically here, that the First Amendment is not just about the separation of church and state. The First Amendment also protects all of the rights that were under threat in the Protestant Reformation. The burning of the martyrs for their pamphlets, the burning of the martyrs and the confiscation of their property for preaching sermons, for proselytizing, for believing different. All of those things are in the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution to protect Protestantism in America. Not only are they there to protect Protestantism, they are to protect the promotion of the three angels' messages and the gospel to all the world. Now I want you to hear from James Madison, because you're Americans, yes? You need to know the foundation of your country. Does Jefferson believe that there is a separation of church and state? Yes, he does. What about James Madison? I want you to listen to what Madison says. Strongly guarded, as is the separation between religion and government in the Constitution of the United States. Let's pause there. Does Madison believe that the separation exists between religion and government in the U.S. Constitution? Yes or no? Okay, not only does he believe it, he says it's strongly guarded. So those voices that are being raised to argue for a union of church and state are not just unconstitutional, they're un-American. It's an attack on the foundation of this country. The danger of encroachment by ecclesiastical bodies may be illustrated by precedents already furnished in their short history. What he's saying is look at the colonies. You want to see the evils of a union of church and state? Look at the colonies. The official religion in Massachusetts was Puritanism. They had John Calvin's ideas, the union of church and state. They were exceedingly intolerant. They persecuted the Baptists and the Quakers and the Anabaptists. Most people don't realize this. But in Massachusetts, if you were caught as a Quaker, do you know what the punishment was? They'd cut your ear off. That's punishment number 1. Punishment number 2, if you snuck back into Massachusetts as a Quaker, was to have the removal of your other ear. The third penalty was death. Now, if you were a female in Massachusetts and you were a Quaker, they had a different punishment. They would strip you to the waist as a woman and tie you to an ox cart and whip you through the streets. This is the history of the colonies. And that's why at the beginning of America, they say, we want separation of church and state, because they've already seen what happened in the colonies, and they've already seen what happened in England, and they've already seen the Inquisition in Spain and Portugal and Italy. So Madison says there's a separation of church and state. Now you can see the title speaks for itself. You have a public official with a very prominent role says that separation of church and state is a misnomer. Okay? It's a misnomer. Okay, misnomer. Here's the article. It's from The Hill. Of course, it comes from a phrase that was in a letter that Jefferson wrote. It's not in the Constitution. Now, Jefferson and Madison would say it is. And they did say it is. And there it is. Congress is the state, right? You all agree with that? Congress is the state. Shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. That's the church. So you have a separation of church and state right in the First Amendment. There it is. That's not me telling you that. That's Madison. Madison again. The purpose of a separation of church and state is to keep forever from these shores the ceaseless strife that has soaked the soil of Europe in blood for centuries. Does Madison believe in a separation of church and state? Yes. Why does he believe in it? He says it's necessary to keep bloodshed from the soil of America. Madison again. In the papal system, government and religion are in a manner consolidated, and that is found to be the worst of governments. So church and state is the worst of governments. That's what was proven in Massachusetts. That's what was proven in Rome with the persecution of the Christians. Madison again. The number, the industry, and morality of the priesthood and the devotion of the people have been manifestly increased by the total separation of the church from the state. Does Madison believe that there is a separation of church and state in the Constitution? Brothers and sisters, I want to tell you he absolutely believes it. Great Controversy says, the image to the beast represents that form of apostate Protestantism which will be developed when the Protestant churches shall seek the aid of the civil power for the enforcement of their dogmas. It's right there. That's what you're looking for. And so if you're trying to figure out where we are on this on the scale of time, okay, what you're looking for as a road sign is the attempt by Protestantism to unite church and state. Is that taking place today? Yes, it absolutely is. We're going to talk about that more in the second presentation. We're going to conclude with this slide. All right, I think my time is almost expired. Concluding with this slide. Who is this? How do you know that's Samson? So just because you're bald, that's Samson? You're right, it's Samson. Okay? Now I want you to think about this story. You know, the scriptures hold all of our beliefs. All of the Adventist beliefs are in the scriptures. We're slow of learning. We're dull of hearing. We're not paying attention. Did you know the story of the separation of church and state is in the story of Samson? Let's talk about it. Here you have a man who is the greatest, the strongest, the most powerful. Right? Why is he the strongest? It's because there was a covenant. His mother covenanted with God, and he covenanted with God that he would be something from his birth. What was that thing? Samson was to be a Nazarite from his birth. There was a covenant. The covenant is holy. It's the secret of his strength. He was told not to drink wine. Don't ever drink wine. Keep it from your lips. You're to be pure so that your mind works properly, so you can hear the Holy Spirit. Now, Samson was incredibly strong. Samson is a type of Christ. We could talk about that a little bit. You know, Samson was betrayed by Judah, the tribe of Judah. Jesus was betrayed by Judas. They tied Samson up and they brought him down to the Philistines and betrayed him. And all of a sudden, his hands are free. They tied Jesus up and they betrayed him to the priests and the scribes. And all of a sudden, his hands are free. And Jesus heals, right? And then his hands are back down here. Okay, go ahead, tie me back up again. Now, there's many things about the story of Samson. When you start to look, you can see the parallels. We're going to look at Samson and his fall. How does he fall? Samson has a problem with women who are Philistine. His parents want him to marry a nice Hebrew girl, I'm sure. Samson, why don't you marry Beth down the street? What about this girl down the street? Samson likes heathen women. And Samson has repeatedly gone to the Philistine women. Now, what is a woman a symbol of in the scriptures? So you have a strong man in a covenant relationship with God, and he's going to an impure woman. Is he married to Delilah? Delilah is a whore. Is that so? Do we have a story in the scriptures in Revelation 17 about a whore? Now, what does the whore want with America? She wants to bring her to her knees. And that is what Delilah wants to do. In fact, there is Samson on her knees. And so Samson is in this illicit, intimate relationship with Delilah, who is a whore. And he is in a covenant relationship with God. Yes? Now, Samson is in a sexually immoral relationship with the whore. Is that so? What's happening in Revelation chapter 17? You have a whore, and she's in an intimate relationship with the kings of the earth. Now, who is she supposed to be intimate with? Only Jesus, because she is the church, right? She is a church. And so she has a husband, but she's left that husband to unite with the government. And that's what makes her a whore. Yes? So let's just play it out. Samson and Delilah. Delilah says to Samson, Samson, what is the secret of your strength? And wouldn't the whore like to know what the secret of America's strength is? Oh, I think she knows, actually. But she asks Samson, Delilah says, what is the secret of your strength? And he says, why do we need to talk about this? We're having such a good time together. And she says, if you love me, you'll tell me. And he gets tired of it, and finally he tells her, listen, if you tie me up with new ropes, I'll be weak like other men. So then she makes him fall asleep. In an intimate relationship, how do you make somebody fall asleep? You You're intimate with them, are you not? She makes him fall asleep. And then she ties him up. And then she yells in his ear, Samson, the Philistines are upon you. And he stands up, pop, 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 pop. He flexes, pop, pop, pop. Where are they? And she says, you lied to me. And he says, give me a break. This again? And a little while later, she says, Samson, what is the secret of your strength? And he says to her, girl, why do we have to talk about this? And she says, tell me. If you love me, you'll tell me. You're keeping it from me. Tell me. And he says, if you tie me up with green willow switches, I'll be weak like other men. So she makes him fall asleep. And she ties him up with green willow switches. And then she says in his ear, Samson, the Philistines are upon you. And they're in the back room. And Samson stands up and he roars and he says, where are they? Pop, pop, pop. Flex. Shreds it all. And she says, this man has entirely too much vitality still. And she says, you mocked me. And he says, oh man, why do we have to talk? 3 times this happens. But Samson is in an intimate relationship with the whore. A union exists between them, an illicit union. And finally, after they do the thing with the weaving the hair in the loom, and he picks the loom up and he throws it out the window, and she's like, you mocked me again and again. And she wears him down. And finally he says to her, you want to know why I'm strong? I'll tell you. I'm sick of this. You want to know the secret? Fine. He says, from my birth, I've been a Nazirite. My hair has never been cut. And if you cut my hair, I'll be weak like other men. And that's the secret. I'm telling you the truth. And that whore makes him fall asleep because she doesn't have his best interests in heart. She's in it for the money and the power. And she makes that man who's in a covenant relationship with God fall asleep. This country is great because it is in a covenant relationship with God to safeguard liberty of conscience. Let there be no doubt in your mind that is the secret of its greatness. You lose liberty of conscience in this country on a national level, you lose American greatness. To propose uniting church and state is to breach the covenant relationship with God. Let me tell you how the story ends. She makes him fall asleep and she cuts his hair. And then she says to him, Samson, wake up. The Philistines are upon you. And he wakes up and he thinks to himself he's going to go out and shake himself like before. But he does not know that the Lord has departed from him. It's over. And they take him and they abuse him. And they put his eyes out. And very interestingly, you know what the Bible says? It says they took him to Gaza. That is interesting because Gaza's in the news a whole lot these days, isn't it? And there's this big building project that's supposed to take place over there. That's kind of interesting. They take him to Gaza and they hold a big heathen party. And it's at that party that he brings the house down on the pagans. Because this is a story about the end of the world. It's a true story, but it has clear last day implications. The separation of church and state is for all of the marbles. You lose separation of church and state in America on a national level. You lose the covenant with God. And that's how the story ends. The house comes down on all the pagans. So as an American, while you see the conflict coming, you're to stand in the breach.